Recibí un mensaje anoche. El mensaje vino del centro de videojuegos.
Hoy se reportó la desaparición del presidente de Encom, Kevin Flynn. Fue visto por última vez en su casa con su hijo Sam.
Ese número tiene 20 años desconectado.
Hola, papá. Esto no está pasando.
Tron Legacy, la película más esperada del 2010, por fin llega a las pantallas. Tras retrasos de la cinta, llega a las salas de todo el mundo, siendo el estreno de culto del año. Esta película de ciencia ficción no es la continuación de algún videojuego como muchos piensan, ni un remake. Es la continuación de la primera película de 1982, escrita y dirigida por Steven Lindenberg. Tras 20 años y una secuela de videojuegos, Disney apuesta a la realización de la secuela de esta maravillosa película. Después de Tron, el cine jamás fue igual.
The thing that intrigued me about animation, there were a couple things that I really liked about animation. One was the fact that not too many people were doing it. In Boston at that time, it was already very strange to get into film, let alone animation. We made a film called Cosmic Cartoon, which then got nominated the first year of the Student Academy Awards. And it was sort of a tripped out, arty film. So even back then, we were sort of on the horns of a dilemma. The original Lisberger Studios was artistically inclined, not commercially inclined. We were excited about backlit animation, which was a way to create visual effects that weren't based on reflective light. It wasn't painted cells. It was mats with light shining directly into the lens of the camera, and the light would be diffused. And you got very intense colors because you used theatrical gels, so the saturations were really pleasing. People weren't doing backlit characters. They were using it as an effect to make things glow and pulse and logos. And what we did was we tried to do a character that was backlit. And two of the key people at Lisberger Studios were two animators, John Norton and Roger Allers.
This was a tiny studio of, people in their 20s just getting together and doing whatever they could find to do. We were doing commercials, we did Sesame Street, Electric Company, that kind of stuff. And Steve was kind of the force that held the whole studio together.
John did a drawing of a line character, and then we transferred it to Codalith, and we backlit it. And that test was this liquid neon character. And he was electronic. And since he was electronic, we nicknamed him Tron. In his first carnation, just this little test, he smashed these two discs of light together, and they exploded and circled around and came back. And it worked out really well, that little piece of animation. And so we had this electronic warrior as a character in the studio, but we weren't sure what we were really going to do with that yet.
Steve sold it as a radio promo spot.
Rock 94 and a half. WCOZ.
En 1982, la computación recién hacía sus grandes pasos para quedarse en el cine. La primera película con animación 3D fue Tron.
Thing about Walt Disney, whenever he saw a new technology, other people might have been afraid of it, but he could immediately see the possibilities in it and use it. Use it to his advantage and create something new out of it. In the case of Tron, I would say it's taking computer technology, which was in its infancy at the time, and making something new with it. Turning it into a film, which I think a lot of people felt like, yeah, big deal, so what? But it was a big deal.
What made the studio decide to really push on with the movie, I think, was the video game craze that was happening through America at that time.
We were just finishing up on Watcher in the Woods, and I remember being in my office one day and Steven Lisberger walked in, and I had never met him before, and he came in and he told me very passionately about the screenplay of Tron, and he also had with him a number of illustrations, and it was pretty evident that this guy already had done a lot of work and had a lot of people do some work on what looked to be a very speculative and very different.
Computer simulation at that time, and nobody had really used in the mass amount of time and done that amount of footage that we needed to do this movie. And there was some skepticism about its dependability and whether any company could do that. And I had done a reel for Information International, the III sample reel that had shown at SIGGRAPH, where I did this juggler and edited together all the work that we had done there, which was some pretty significant stuff at that time. And it was put together in a way that was really professional. I really started meshing together and sat down and started doing drawings and talking about the way that the processes could fit together. And I suggested that we could do all the backgrounds and the craft and all of that in CG. And that by doing that, we could have this phenomenal kind of movement in the movie. We could do this point of view that nobody had ever seen.
Richard championed the backlight and also was connected with III, so was also very knowledgeable about computer graphics, and had known Sid Mead. I was very interested in getting Mobius on the project, which Donald made happen, and it turned out that the combination of those two was just beautiful, because Sid is so futuristic and so stylish in such a severe way, and Mobius, his artwork is so spiritual and charming, that between the two it really felt right.
Sid Mead is one of the world's most phenomenal designers and futurists. I think the work that he did in Tron was exceptional. I think it gave a kind of style and class that helped set up the stylization of the movie, which was critical for it to hold up over time and for it to be something that was new. Mead did the tanks and the light cycles and Sark's carrier.
Algo limitado y con tiempos larguísimos por algunos bits, esta película creó un mundo nuevo, no solo dentro de la película, sino también en el mundo cinematográfico. Sus efectos revolucionarios fueron nominados a los Óscares en 1983, sin algún éxito, ya que creían que todos los efectos visuales habían sido creados por las computadoras, cuestión que fue aclarada tiempo más tarde. Su complejidad y belleza solo se vio en esta película.
The studio decided that since this was a first-time director, and since this first-time director was proposing a rather, some would say, outrageous way of making a film, Steven was allowed to go and shoot a number of scenes using actors dressed in kind of gray costumes. He shot it onto 35mm black and white, and then the codeless were made. And the interesting part about the test is that these actors were all against white backgrounds.
We had a young Frisbee champion named Sam Schatz who came in, and we had all this great stuff that they gave us that was left over from Black Hole. And we put this costume on Sam, and he threw his Frisbee and he broke out of some prison cell, I think, and blasted one of those black hole robots or something. We did some backgrounds and composited the whole thing.
The tests were successful. It proved that Steven could direct. It proved that the technology would work. But it was Bruce Logan who said, after the tests had been completed, after the ink and painting had been completed and the compositing of the characters against backgrounds had been completed, he said, you know what, we should consider shooting this against all black instead of white.
We went black because, frankly, there weren't enough lights in Hollywood to create the amount of white that we needed to do that. Because obviously, if you're trying to make a black background, you don't have to light the black background. If you have a white background, everything has to be lit. And we were working at such incredible f-stops and low shutter angles, and we were welding with light on that show.
And I can remember going home that night and literally taking drawings and markers and marking and doing it so that I could actually figure it out, what would happen if you shot against black and where you would have to roto versus if you shot against white and where you would have to paint. And doing some rough calculations on how long it would take you to roto versus how long it would take you to paint and so on and so forth. And
was staggering was the actual technique that we finally used, which was to blow up every single frame of 75 minutes of film to a 14-inch codolith, and then treat a live-action movie like an animated movie.
So even though we shot live-action footage, we turned each frame back into individual frames or individual cells. Think of them as animation cells, but they're not hand-drawn. They're made photographically.
Ironically, there's very little computer power put to this.
Once we had the photography, then those individual frames of film were put into 2 photorotoscope machines. That is, basically takes the film, projects it down onto a new piece of film that's a large piece of film, approximately 20 inches by 12 inches. They were basically, for each live-action character, an exposure for the main body. There was an exposure for the circuits. There was an exposure for the whites of the eyes and the whites of the teeth, maybe one other pass. So it was roughly 5 passes per character.
So after you've isolated all these different areas, you have to still photograph each isolated area separately over and over onto one frame of film, and oftentimes you're having these layers. The simplest one would be 6, 7 layers deep. The most complex one could be 25, 30 layers deep.
Sin Tron no existiría Pixar.
I was working at the Disney Studios. I was an animator on Mickey's Christmas Carol when Tron was being produced. 2 of my friends, Jerry Reese and Bill Croyer, were working on Tron. And they were doing the storyboarding and the choreography, you might say, of all the computer animation. They were over in one of the trailers, and they had a computer that was hooked via phone line back to New York with Magi Synthevision. And my good friend Chris Wedge was back there working on the animation, and he would send over the phone line the scenes frame by frame by frame for them to look at, some of the early renderings. For me, this was some of the very first computer animation I had ever seen, and it was so exciting. The first scene that I remember them working on was the light cycle sequence, and it absolutely blew me away.
Tron narra las aventuras de un programador que se introduce en el circuito de una computadora donde los programas tienen vida y personalidad propia. Dentro del sistema, Flynn se encuentra a un programa de seguridad llamado Tron, el cual lo ayudará en su aventura por desconectar al Master Control, que tiene subyugado a todos los programas de la red. Después del lanzamiento de la película Tron, también el videojuego arcade que se muestra en la misma película fue lanzado al público en general. Le siguieron secuelas para consolas como Atari, computadora, entre otras consolas. La secuela de la película fue seguida en los juegos de video. La primera secuela palpable fue Tron 2.0 y después Tron Evolution, que se sitúa antes de la película Tron Legacy. Desde sus inicios, Tron fue una película revolucionaria en su tiempo, y hoy en día nos sigue maravillando con sus efectos especiales y su hermosa estética. Este año podremos disfrutar de la secuela de esta película, y sin duda nos seguirá maravillando y cambiando el mundo del cine.